Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jayo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. BTS, Blackpink, Big Bang, Girls' Generation. These are the names that are very familiar to music fans all around the world. But at the birthplace of K-pop, the idol groups are not the only act in town. To talk about the recent history and evolution of popular music in Korea, and many different styles and genres of Korean music, we have Youngdae Kim joining us from Korea. Youngdae Kim is a music critic and ethnomusicologist whose writings have appeared in both Korean and American media outlets, and he has appeared on numerous TV shows and podcasts on both countries as well. Welcome to the Korea Society, Youngdae. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, or actually, good morning to you.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Youngdae. I'm a music critic, and thank you so much for having me.
Great. Quick reminder to our viewers, if you have any questions, you can send your questions via Twitter at Korea Society Art or email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. So Youngdae, I just wanted to start with kind of a big question. We were talking about the title of this program, which is From Gayo to K-pop. And somebody who is a huge fan of K-pop told me, what's Gayo? What does that mean? And I wasn't quite sure how to answer that question. So I was hoping that you can help me. So how do we define Gayo? What does it mean? And when do we start seeing that word appear?
Yeah, so I mean the history of the word, I mean the definition, the context, they're all different. So that's why I said earlier that this is going to be the toughest question to answer. The meaning, first of all, it simply means a song, or because Gayo is two different Chinese characters that combined as a one word. So Ka is a song, and the Yo, more interestingly, is a song. So it's more like a song, or singing a song, or a song for singing, or song that you can sing or recite, or so it could mean many different things. But one thing is very clear: it's a song. So, but what form, in what context, it varies, and it's been changed a lot from let's say 8th century all the way to right now, up until now. So it would mean a lot of different things to different people, but the bottom line is that it is song, and it means it's a song for singing. So but basically, technically, it's a word for popular music. That's kind of general usage. But in that context, we technically, you have to add the word 대중, which means a mass, or people, or public. So the word basically Gayo in today's context is 대중가요, is a popular music. So to answer the question, we have to actually examine the words that mean or indicate the idea of popular music. So there are, for me, there are three different words, really popular words that we still use to indicate Korean popular music. First thing is definitely 가요, or 대중가요, and there's another word, 유행가, or 유행가요. 유행 is it means trend, or fad, or popular. So if you think of the English word popular music, it has actually two different meanings. So first of all, it means music which is popular. Popular among general public. But the second meaning, it is almost kind of antonym of art music. So it's music by the people, by common ordinary people, for ordinary people. So so it's a kind of opposite side of classical or court or art music. So 대중, I mean, 가요 is a similar thing. It could mean a song that is really popular at the time among the public, but also it could mean a music which is not a court or noble or classical music. So yeah, I mean that's a kind of terminology issue. And the Korean people has been using this word from Goryeo dynasty. It's from 8th to 13th, 14th century. At the time, it was because we didn't have any type of recording, at the time still. So it was documented as a literature. It's a song, but it's a kind of poems. You could recite it. They definitely recite it, and they were actually singing it. But it was form of poetry. Okay, poems. So it's a song, but it's the song as a forms of poems. That's a kind of oldest proof that we use the word 가요. It was called 고려 가요. So 가요 of Goryeo dynasty. But in the very modern, contemporary context, the first 가요 for me, I mean, the usage of 가요, the word 가요, or the recordings or songs was appeared during the Japanese occupation era. It was 1920, middle of 1920, 25, 26. Well, some scholars, many scholars, agree that first 가요 was 1926, Yoon Sim-deok. The song is called 사회 참미. It was actually a remade song, Korean version of the song of I forgot the title actually.
It's like a European song, wasn't it?
Yeah. I come back to that later if I remember the title.
Yeah.
But but what was the change? What was the significant change at the time? It was actually a adoption of Western music through Japan at the time. So it's a Western harmony scale or type of institution, type of teaching like piano or other types of instruments. So through that way, through that teaching and a learning experience, they started to establish a Korean way of making, Western influenced or Japanese influenced pop music, distinctive different from the pre-existing Korean folk tradition or farmers music or other percussion or other type of folk music. So it was 1920, 25, around those times when actually westernized Korean pop music, which they called 가요 actually. So the archive really said that the word 가요 was really circulated 1920, and it was at the same time they actually established a first 가요 association or type of like institution that managed all the different activities. So yeah, it was 20, and but up until the 40s and 50s, the 가요 is all about the kind of historical experience of people. If you know the history, it was the occupation era. Then after 1945, then Korea liberated from Empire Japan. But then we had Korean War, 51. So the song, because it's a people's song, it's mass song. So it was about war, separated families, in the sorrow of going back to the homeland they never can. and the song, the structure, harmony is definitely influenced by both country. I mean, U.S. and Japan. But at the same time, it was heavily influenced by the contemporary classical music at the time. Um, then it's too long.
No, 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 go ahead.
My
No,
answer?
I'm
Okay,
fascinated
okay.
because I didn't realize. What do you mean by that? It was influenced by the classical music at the time, because you can kind of see
Yeah.
the influence of obviously
Well, I mean,
jazz or whatever the
right,
swing
right.
music, what was popular. But so, what was sort of the what were they? Do we have any
Well,
idea what
yeah.
they were listening to and what they were being influenced by, as what they sort of as they were sort of sort of being faced with this new form of music
Yeah,
that
I mean,
they were now.
jazz influence really started to come by after 50s. But before 50s, they had a lot of mixed influence, but one of them is definitely classical music. I mean, in terms of the instrumentation, because I mean, those are the things they actually learn at the time. The violin, piano, definitely, and again, it's not for the ordinary people. They're not affordable, definitely. So it's mostly, so the interesting thing is the first, probably you can say the first actual Korean pop music was kind of outcome of high society. I mean, noble society's activities or hobbies. And they're the only one, kind of their kind of exclusive access to the I mean the institutions. I mean the learning experience. So that's what I meant by the classical music influence. But actual classical music influence is definitely came later during the 1980s. Again, I come back to the point later. You mentioned jazz. It's definitely probably the biggest influence during the 1950s, Gaio. So many, because I mean jazz in general, not just swing music or modern jazz or bebop or whatever, but jazz in general. I mean, idea of the jazz chord progression, harmony, or the instrumentation like saxophone and other like brass music. Um, it it as a whole really influenced Korean pop music and the Korean aesthetics at the time and the idea of modernity. So we definitely started to have a lot of like those vocabulary. Like, for instance, during the 1950s, we had a lot of songs that actually has an English title. I mean, not English title, but English, the Korean title with using English words or translation. I mean, the Korean English or something like that. So, for instance, there is a song, really popular song. The title was "Shoeshine Boy" or "America Chinatown" or "Arizona Cowboy." It really doesn't tell you about the American culture in details. It is actually not. I mean, it's not really about the American culture, but it was more of using the kind of novel feature of the word. I mean, English word or English culture or the idea of reminding you that the song is actually kind of modern thing because I mean jazz at the time. So I talked to a lot of like older generation, gentlemen or ladies and 할머니 할아버지. Um, for them, jazz was not they don't remember jazz as a music or jazz as a kind of genre. For them, jazz is just modern music.
Yeah.
You know, just really popular modern music from Western world. And for them, jazz is remembered as a loud music, kind of rebel music. Yeah, it's not really novel or music with dignity. That for them, jazz was just too loud. There's a really funny history, but again, I mean, in every generation, loud music, rebel music would normally become a thing, right? So
Right.
1950s, that's the youngsters' music, jazz, definitely, because I mean, there are always, if you look at the history of Korean popular music, there's always kind of 5 to 10 years time lapse. What I mean by that is, if something is really popular in the States or in UK, mostly in the States back then it will kind of come to Korea and started to be adopted and localized. Um, it would normally take 5 to 10 years because we don't have any kind of type of media that we can enjoy music simultaneously or as a contemporary music. So, and also it took so much time for Korean musicians to actually learn everything, like from chord progression, instrumentation and things like that. So I mean, like everyone knows, jazz been around since the 1920s, but finally, during the 50s, actually Korean gayo started to adopt and successfully adopted the idioms of jazz music. So that's 50s. And we have 50 years to go. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the whole history here. So I'm giving you the context of how gayo, the idea of gayo has been changed.
Right. But at the same time, you just mentioned something very important, which is that you need musicians to be trained. And they have to not only know the instruments, but know how to arrange, how to write songs in a way that's different from what it used to be. And also, we also have to remember in the 1950s, this is, during the war and after the war, and we cannot not talk about the presence of American troops in Korea and what kind of influence that they had to the Korean popular music. So can you tell us a little bit about that, the role that the presence of American troops played, that played in Korean popular music from the 1950s and so on?
Yeah, I mean, from the 50s, a lot of modern Korean gayo pop musicians started their career as a musicians, played for American troops, like during Korean War, and later for the Vietnam War. So there are a lot of like interesting footage that you can find on the YouTube, but it was really interesting history because I mean at the time, 50s and 60s, American troops, they actually wanted to bring a lot of U.S. musicians, really popular at the time, but and they did sometime, but as time goes on, it was all about the money. It was too expensive for them to bring all the like big namers to the Korean Peninsula. You know the and a lot of extra monies for food and everything guaranteed. So what they come up with is the idea of training really talented Korean musicians who already like familiar with American music and the vocal style or other type of practices popular in the United States. So some of the really talented or westernized Korean musicians at the time was recruited. Sometimes they're just voluntarily um, um, volunteer for the job because I mean it definitely is a big money. So those traditions started during the wartime, and after wartime, um, like some of we still have a really big military camps, U.S. base in different cities. So they still need musicians for their entertainment. A lot of like nightclubs built, um, and again, they were unsuccessful bringing U.S. big namers or American big stars because of the money. So they instead um, try to recruit a copycat, to put it simply. So the someone who can really play like Hendrix, sing like Diana Ross, um, was something like that. That idea, and it was not a really a short it was really long process from 50s to the early 80s. The traditions had been going on, and so the U.S. military camp is most famous one is Eighth Army in Yongsan area in Seoul. It was both a performing venue, but also kind of like training boot camp.
Mm.
So for aspiring young musicians, it was really good job to be reached in a short period of time. But at the same time, it was really as a result. I mean, it was actually not maybe not their intentions, but as a result, it was really kind of good opportunity for them to get to know what kind of taste that American people had at the time. Because I mean, there are a lot of like U.S. soldiers who constantly requested some of the popular songs at the time, or some of the um, some of the music they individually preferred. So I mean, for instance, it's too easy call, but for like African American soldiers, they would request R&B, right, or disco funk, or those type of songs. But for Caucasian or white soldiers, they would want some country music or folk music or the rock music. So in the end, South Korean musicians who was recruited by the by the clubs, Eighth Army Club, for instance, was successfully kind of equipped with a lot of different musical idioms.
Mm.
So they're like a kind of versatile, multifaceted musician who can sing, play, you know, whatever they requested, like from funk to the hard rock, psychedelic. So probably that's one of the kind of major reasons why traditionally Korean pop music, I mean still K-pop, has a lot of different genres in one song or one albums, and they don't really care about the kind of authenticity of the genre. It's more of a kind of hybrid movement, of popular music. That's just one theory. But anyway, like you said, U.S. The wartime, the landscape after the war, Korean War, and the newly built U.S. nightclub in Seoul, everywhere actually, really helped Korean pop music modernize itself, or westernized itself, or Americanize it. Um, and through that, South Korean pop music was kind of evolved into more contemporary pop music. Because I mean, they kind of closed the gap between Korea and United States, and they actually started to be catching up with the global trend, uh, or U.S. trend in pop music. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but were they
Yeah.
also was it more because when we think about American pop music, we tend
Sure.
to think about, say, a rock group or
Mhm.
a singing group. um Maybe I'm being too simplistic, but when I think of Kayo, it's about singers. It's about
Yeah.
another Korean word, hasu. That's what everybody used to
Mhm.
say, a
Right.
singer. So how
Mhm.
did that
Singer.
evolve instead of having, because I think the group music, despite the huge success of BTS and all that, which we'll talk about later, group music, it was not really a familiar concept for Koreans for many years, or if they were very much like,
Right.
there will be like one rock group that was popular, but it was very much about singers. It's about the singing ability of this particular individual that sort of made them a star. So can you tell us a little
Right.
bit
Right.
about like how Kayo sort of started to emerge, as if it ever did, a distinctive form of music, and how it started to sort of become popular to people? Like
Right.
what was popular to people, say, in the 60s and 70s? What were they listening to? Because it's also the time when
Right.
a lot of the public were not really exposed to American culture. There were a lot of censorship. The market wasn't as wide open as it is now. So I feel like there was definitely a different thing going on. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of that during the 60s and 70s, how Korean singers and
Right.
musicians begin to evolve?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, the 60s probably the first prime decade for first heyday maybe for Korean popular music because like you said, I mean like you kind of implied it's Kayo is more about singers rather than the performer. I mean the instrument performers, instrumentalist. So you I mean it's same in US pop music. So if you well, if you talk about the era and defining era, you can definitely have a defining singers at the time or singers of the decade. So it's the same thing in South Korea. I mean, I already talked about 50s, but as 60s went on, it really started to evolve into a more star um, centric scene, and those stars again are really trained in this kind of system, U.S. Nightclubs and a local venue. Um, but again, Gayo is not a really a particular form. It's not a genre. It's kind of umbrella term for indicating a lot of like different styles coexist at the time. So if you look at the 60s, we're talking about the 60s, but if you really look at the landscapes of music of 60s in Korea, you will really easily find that there are already a lot of different type of genres established. It's that's probably why I should call it the first heyday, because I mean you will definitely have a varieties, and you have some of the big namers, superstars, and the legendary like rock band, first rock band ever. So this was the first time um, that we can it's safe to say that there are first like lines of um, big singers, standard pop singers. They're more like based on the kind of big band jazz or swing music. Well, it's not strictly jazz, but the music with big band ensemble instrumentation. So we have Choi Hee-jun, probably the one of the oldest standard pop singers, who's definitely trained in this U.S. military pop scene. Then Patty Kim, and Imija. Those are probably three most famous giants at the time. And in rock scene, we have Shin Jung-hyun, the legendary figure, who's known as a first um, you know godfather of Korean rock and roll, who's heavily influenced by the Jimi Hendrix and all the different types of rock and roll at the time. And at four, Eduhwa in actually Korean language, and keyboys, and those are the guys who actually started to emulate rock and roll idioms, and more importantly, the techniques as a rock star, and all the like the little techniques of the playing guitar, um, and the reason why they were able to do that was the dissemination of record. So before the 50s and 40s, there are only few people who actually owned a phonograph, gramophone or record player. But by the 60s, it became very common thing. So middle-aged families and rich families, definitely they were afford to buy new record every week, or every month. So that's how the music local stars actually become pop star,
Mm,
all over South Korea.
right.
So that's 60s. And in the 70s, it actually becoming more common for people buying records, listening to music or playing music. And there are like new stars, new youngsters who are actually influenced by the not only a American pop stars, but also there's Hanbe, the seniors like Patty Kim and Shin Jung Hyun and all those great godfathers or godmothers. So one of them, one of the most popular, um, probably the biggest pop stars in Korean pop history, probably Cho Yong-pil, came along, combining kind of every legacy of South Korean pop music or Kayo before him. He was a rock star, but he's also a really amazing standard pop singer, and he's a guitarist. And he played as a band, as a solo. He even released a lot of albums. Main musical style was trot, Korean traditional vocal music. So by the 80s, it really we really reached a point where individual musical genre developed separately and combined to make a really kind of symbolic pop star, Jo Young-pil, to have all different kinds of influence. And he was also a guy who trained in Eighth Army, but also he um, he's not limited himself in that club scene, but he became a TV star because and radio star actually. Um, so yeah, so times really changed by the 1980s. So if we kind of overview each like decades during the 60s, it was kind of jazz influenced pop singers, um, new kind of rock music that they borrowed from the U.S. pop music, and we have some of the names that you might want to remember. Han Myung-suk, Hyunmi, Kim sisters, Choi Hee-jun again. They're relatively well educated. Some of them, some of college graduated, so they really used kind of the image of elite, educated man. Musically was mostly standard pop, swing, big band. Overall, it's very jazzy. But it was kind of um, localized, based on the Korean sentiment. You know, then probably the most important figure as a singer during the 60s was Lee Mi-ja. He was called easily as a vocal queen at the time, or a queen of allergy, not allergy, it's allergy.
Elegy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Elegy.
allergy.
Yeah.
Yeah. uh, she's very Korean. I mean, her vocal style, um, the wearings, the instrumentation, that she definitely has the unique kind of like mood as a Korean singer. But well, you can say it's an Asian thing, because I mean she's definitely influenced by the Japanese singers, Japanese music as well. But those like sentiment and then mood as Asian singers really made him not a superstar, not just a superstar, but a kind of emblematic figure in the Korean pop music at the time. So in the 60s, we have a huge surge of trot music. And the first trot, like superstars, two superstars came along. It was more like a kind of like 60s, like clash of rock and roll giants in the US or UK, like Beatles, Rolling Stones, and all the British invasion. But we had kind of similar rivalry thing going on back in the 60s. There's Namjin representing Jeollado, and Nahuna representing Gyeongsangdo. So Gyeongsang province, no, Jeolla
Right.
province. So they're the first idol pop stars, idol pop singers, and they established this really like good sometimes crazy frenzy rivalry between two biggest fandoms, and they also represented local community. So they really heavily used their slangs and dialect in public when they speak. So it was really interesting change. Then
I don't want to be
yeah,
too stuck on 60s too much, but we already got questions about
yeah.
trot, trot. So in a very brief way, I know that's impossible, but can you just explain to people who are not familiar with I guess that's a genre in Kayo, right? Trot, like what is a trot exactly? And how is that different from other, say, more the pop standard based music you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's another tricky question. I mean, trot is a genre and probably the oldest modern genre in Korean pop music, along with standard pop or rock. But trot was, I mean, nobody really knows the actual origin of the trot or what actually trot is. I mean, the word trot, came from the English word foxtrot,
Right.
but musically, nothing in common. And some says trot was a kind of Korean local version of enka, the Japanese kind of nostalgic song tradition. Well, definitely a similar chord progression and overall mood. I mean, if you really dissect every like details of the chord progression and the harmony, they definitely different. But you can definitely had a similar feelings when you listen to trot and enka. But again, it's not just Korean and Japan. I mean, if you're really familiar with Asian vocal tradition, vocal music, if you're Indonesian or Chinese or wherever, if you're Asian, you will definitely have a similar vocal tradition in every country, in every Asian country. So we don't know what actually made that kind of tradition, that kind of like kind of common feelings or common preference on choosing which like notes or which scale that we should use to make a kind of nostalgic feeling. But it's a commonality. It's not just between Korea and Japan. But trot again is the oldest type of vocal tradition and the vocal music, and for many decades, it's been respected and despised at the same time. People really loved trot and still loving it because it is just instantly hit you. I mean, it's instantly moves. Um, I mean, moves you. I mean, it just make you feel something because I mean, it's really distinctive and it really emphasize the technicality of vocalist. A lot of runs and vibes. It's like American soul music, or country music. It has definitely like distinctive, weird for youngsters probably, but kind of vocal techniques. And the ideas, the lyrically, the idea is all about relationship, going back to homeland, during the 80s, actually, Trot, the lyrics of Trot was all about the singing of a nightclub experience,
That's right.
meeting
Yeah.
meeting guy and ladies every night, waiting for someone who they actually met last week, but would they come again tonight as well? I mean, those are the actual lyrics because I mean, it was because Trot, one of those genres that reflected um, the ideas of the people at the time. And 1980s trot, it's one of the heydays of trot music, actually. 1980s and early 1990s trot reflected the landscape of soul. And
Mm.
you were familiar with the song Gangnam Style. Gangnam is the kind of southern area of Han River. And there were a lot of like newly built nightclub and a new downtown, it's because all this downtown is located Gangbuk area, but there are a lot of new downtowns new downtown and a lot of nightclubs and residents in Gangnam area. So that it actually associated with the rise of Korean house music or techno or dance music scene, because I mean it actually located in the same area, Gangnam area. So new nightclub, cabaret, uh, who played trot music or music for the older generation on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not very far, but in similar Gangnam area, we had a newly built nightclub exclusively for youngsters. Yeah, they can
Yep.
check your IDs. So if you're really old, yeah, it's impossible for you to go enter this kind of shrine. Anyway, so this newly built Gangnam nightclub and discotheque was served as a cradle for Korean house music, or rap dancers. Um, yeah, where was I? Anyway,
So we're in the 80s now, I think. And you just mentioned
right?
all
Yeah, we
the,
were talking about trot,
yeah.
right?
And
And
then you're also mentioning all the hip hop artists and sort of kind of emerging, and the dance, the sort of the nightclub, maybe not quite hip hop yet, but the house music and techno and all that
right.
stuff. So when does sort of Kayo begin to transition into K-pop as we know it? Was there an event or a turning point? A lot of people talk about 88 Olympics. A lot of people think about the 90s. Obviously one of the biggest group that everybody talks about is Sateji Idol. But what
Right.
happened sort of in the 80s and 90s so there's this one sort of the very traditional Korean popular music that is trot, and that it's even still today very popular. But then there's
Mhm.
also this new kind of, again, the very loud music, the one that all the adults seems to think that it's too loud, and it becomes techno, hip hop, rap,
Right.
and that begins to emerge in the 80s and 90s. So can you tell us, just walk through the 80s and 90s and
Yeah,
how? Yeah.
this is very interesting because I mean, this is really something that many people, especially foreign K-pop consumers, K-pop fans, misunderstood because K-pop. Okay, so Kayo, you mentioned when did K-pop begin to transition into Kayo transition
Right.
into K-pop? It never did. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
'cause,
right.
those are two different words to indicate the same idea. So Kayo is a word used by local people, local Koreans. And K-pop was all of a sudden was a thing when foreign media, foreign press started to use to indicate the music they found during the late 1990s. So it was K-pop. Well, essentially, well, the in terms of vocabulary, K-pop simply means Korean pop music. I mean, following the kind of template of Japanese pop music. But we didn't create we didn't create the word. I mean, it's not a word that we normally use. I mean, still, I mean, a lot of people struggle to use that word because I mean they don't know what it really is. Because we, like everyone knows, now we had the term kayo and 대중음악. It's more close, the close to the idea of popular music. So we have those words, and those are enough. Then we certainly have a word K-pop. So what for me, K-pop automatically has the idea of globality, globalism. So it is not. It doesn't really tell you anything. But one thing that it will tell you is that it's a perspective from outsiders. I mean, we already have a word, kayo. I mean, those things, kayo, K-pop, whatever, they indicate actually the same thing, Korean pop music. But it's all about the usage. Because I mean, when you use the word K-pop, you would automatically have an idea of the whole image, the genre, the visuals and things like that. So nowadays, a lot of people, I don't want to call it misusage, because I mean it's the vocabulary is all about the how people use it, instead of the origins. So K-pop nowadays we use as a synonym of a pop idol music, but it actually is just international version of Kayo, actually. But
Okay.
but I get the idea. So what makes um, distinctively different, K-pop from the earlier Kayo? Okay, so one contribution definitely is an establishment of Korean nightclub in Gangnam area, especially, and Gangbuk area as well. Then I think okay, here's an interesting thing. So if we can call K-pop as a Kayo with global mindset, or global scene, or audience, or market, I can definitely point it out the first K-pop ever, which is 1988 Seoul Olympic theme song, "Hand in Hand" by uh, European Korean group Koreana.
Korean.
Yeah, they were located Switzerland at the time, and they were back in the 70s. They were really kind of popular in European countries, but by the 1988, they were kind of disappearing from the scene. But IOC, the Olympic Association, IOC, and Korean government, they really actively try to find someone who can represent not just Korea, but Korea as a global country. So instead of recruiting Jo Young-pil or Lee Mi-ja, those pop superstars, they found this Koreana. Nobody knew who they were, but Koreana with the composer Giorgio Moroder, the Disco King, they finally come up with first probably globally known Korean song that sold like millions and millions copies globally. So I think it was not Sateju Idol or HOT or Boa, but it was actually Koreana
Mm.
who we can call a first K-pop superstars, because I mean it has everything. I mean, kind of every formula. I mean, they were Korean, but immigrant Koreans, like the same thing happening in K-pop scene nowadays. Korean Americans or Canadian Korean, but they're European Koreans, and it's composed by American composers, which is common practice nowadays as well. George Moroder, and it was sung for global audience, not the local audience. Yeah, same as K-pop nowadays. So I mean, the song and it was just one song, one album, but the idea of global Korean pop music was there. So I think that's a kind of turning point of Korean pop music, because I mean, a lot of Korean musicians by the time was like unconsciously or consciously influenced by the song, because that was actually the first time that, wow, we're singing for a global audience, not just for ourselves. So the every musician said after Koreana, they kind of this similar mindset. So we're playing for our kids, for our peers, but potentially we are playing for the global audience. So Sateji Idol came along. I mean, Sateji, he just changed the whole landscape of South Korea in terms of, you know, he made hip hop and dance music as a thing in K-pop scene. Then, based on those ideas, globalism, Sateji Wider, the rise of hip hop, producer Lee Soo-man came up with this idea that we can create something like Korean version of New Kids on the Block or New Edition or Bobby Brown. So he made HOT and SES, the first girl group, modern girl group. Then, all of a sudden, Hallyu broke out. The Asian countries really started to heavily consume, Korean popular culture, not just music, but the drama, and movie, everything. Then, based on that move, we had Clone, they really became the dance duo, really made a huge hit in Taiwan. Then probably first consciously prepared for the global market, Poa came along. And everything changed after, since her debut, because Korean pop industry, they really started to pay attention to the system, not just making a pop star for fans, but they actually started to be aware of the system to kind of consistently, make a pop star. So they learned a lot of systems from US and from Japan and from Scandinavian countries, because they had a huge like scenes and an institution system, to kind of make a new musician, not just singer, but a composer, producers. So I mean, they learned from Berry Gordy, Motown, 1960s, and how to kind of make a kind of signature company sound, and how to like manage in-house producers who can make a consistent hits. And they also learn this songwriting camp system from Japan, because Japanese pop industry already established this system in J-pop many years ago. So Isuman and other Korean producers at the time, um, you know, learned that system and adopted it in the K-pop world. And that's how everything started. The K-pop thing, the whole industry template module, whatever you call it. Yeah.
So do you, I mean, which is really interesting thing to think about, because at least for me, do you think there's two different models that are existing in Korea, like in terms of Korean popular music? One that is really for the locals, the Koreans, which I know, obviously BTS and Blackpink and all these people
Right.
are incredibly popular in Korea too.
Mm.
But is there
Yeah.
sort of the kind of the kayo that still exists for the local consumption versus, sort of the K-pop for the rest of the world?
Yeah. I mean, if you're really hardcore K-pop fans who can, I mean, constantly streaming for your favorite idol, you can definitely see a really weird discrepancies in the Korean pop chart. Because I mean, everyone, the global K-pop fans know BTS, Blackpink, and the idol music, but on the chart, actually, there are a lot of like weird names that they don't know at all. I mean, at all, because there are nowadays, especially after K-pop's become a thing, and the K-pop companies really pay attention to the music for global audience, and they really focused on this format of pop idols. um Actually, the taste of pop music, among the general public, has been really segregated, individualized, or something like that. So then how they consume the music is very different from each other. So for K-pop, international K-pop fans especially, and the idol fans in South Korea, they stream, watching YouTube, buying CDs, and um going concert. But a lot of like ordinary people, like middle age, um like not really hardcore music fan, I think more kind of passive music fans, they would normally just turn on TV and watch a lot of uh TV shows. So based on that kind of different type of consuming music, South Korean industry really developed a lot of um, devices for those generations, for those consumers. For instance, most popular way of consuming music nowadays is through competition, TV reality show and competition. And especially Koreans are so obsessed with this kind of vocal competition. It was not really about a music or how elaborate the arrangement or the technicality of playing guitars or something like that. It was mostly about how good and amazing the singers are. So tons of vocal competition every year, new vocal competition reality show comes along every year. Then nowadays, I mean, for the last 2 years, one of the most popular vocal competition is trot. The
Right.
competition surrounding the genre of trot. Mr. Trot, Miss Trot became really a thing, and it actually kind of um, strengthened this trend
Right.
of two different styles of two different methods of consuming music, two different type of um, music public, I would say. Coming because I mean there are during the 90s and 80s we have normally a one really big musical mass, music public. They're listening to same radio station. There were only three TV stations. We had no cable TVs. So public's taste and their interest was exclusively controlled by the limited
The three
big
big
media
media.
radio. Yeah, everyone's singing along same thing. Everyone's buying buying same records. That's why Kim Gun-mo, Shin Seung-won, and all those like 90s big namers were the not only a pop idols, but at the same time, people's singers at the time. But now, that kind of trend doesn't exist anymore because I mean, we have very distinctive, hugely exclusive popular music taste and trend separately. So
Mhm.
there are genre music. You have hip hop, R&B. They have exclusive fans there. Then trot or vocal competition. And the thing is that this vocal competition is usually comes with a really beautiful, moving stories. So it's not just about the music, but the history and the family history is, or the hardship or something like that. So they actually, for me, I assume that people are actually consuming the stories and narrative rather than the music itself. Anyway, there's a vocal competition and the trot thing and this idol music and the rest of the genres.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, thank you for asking.
So we cannot, because as you can imagine, a lot of people are asking questions about BTS because we cannot title a program
They were
with a
already
K-pop in it.
disappointed, I guess.
I know. I hope
We
they are
never say a word
not.
on
I hope.
BTS
I
so
know.
far.
I hope they learned something about how BTS came into being somehow. But I guess a lot of people so many people have been talking about why are they so successful, and I mean, if somebody can sort of come up with a formula, I'm sure everybody will be successful. So I wouldn't really go there. But do you think somebody like BTS can really influence what's happening in, say, US pop scene? Or is the success of BTS going to change, as it has already probably done, what's going on in Korea? Like, what, I guess, that's two separate questions. I realize that. So would BTS keep going to be successful, and would that open more doors to other Koreans musicians to become and Blackpink is also becoming a huge star here as well. So will that keep happening? And then how will that change the Korean music business? Again, I realize that that's a huge question again, but
Yeah, huge question. Well, I think BTS probably the most um important figure in Korean pop music history because I mean it's happening globally. I mean we had a lot of like really amazing musicians, in terms of their skills and talent. But this is happening really a different world. I mean BTS not just changing the idea of Korean pop music in general, but it actually changing the whole kind of cultural traffic globally. I so for instance, in this galaxy, there was only one sun. I mean, for 200 years, it was U.S. Well, UK, but UK music was usually part of U.S. industry, Canada as well, and Latin music. Well, definitely is a thing right now. But Latin, along with European culture and African American culture, those were a part of American society. But all of a sudden, this guys from South Korea, they're changing everything. I mean, the most important thing is, again, there's this cultural traffic. There's only one sun, spreading the rays everywhere, and there was no competition. No matter what, for 200 years, they never allowed any international superstar become a pop star. I think that that's really important implication. There were a lot of like genre music stars, well, maybe not star, but great musicians who would do jazz, classical, R&B, hip hop, but they we had never had Asian pop star who's who is actually a global pop star at the same time. I read a Rolling Stone this the issue recently, and the title itself is really simple and symbolic. It says "World's Biggest Band." Simple as that. You know, we don't have any. They don't have any like another words to describe this band anymore. No
Right.
adjective. No, yeah, they don't need that. They're just world's biggest band. I think that implied a lot. I mean, it was not just music, but the whole idea that if you're Asian, traditionally, sorry, if you're Asian, an Asian kid who's doing music, if you're a rapper, you will kind of consciously or unconsciously think that you are a local star. You're an Asian pop star or Korean pop star for Korean people. Well, we had Hallyu before, but it was mostly a Asian phenomenon, um, and a European country as well, but not a nobody actually dominated United States pop scene before BTS. So it was actually not about the talent itself. It was not about the music itself, but the whole influence they're making. Whole imagination they would create. It's phenomenal. I mean, it's a really historic movement. So we're not really knowing what's really happening because we're in the middle of that. But after 5 years, 10 years, we will definitely look back now, and yeah, they made it. They made this whole transition, the
Mm.
whole change of history back then. So I'm still figuring out, honestly. I mean, I think, well, for me, the most important difference of BTS is their music. Definitely, they're talking about the performance, the visuals and music video, especially social media. Everyone's having social media, so it's probably one of their tactics, one of the way they communicate with fans. But it's not a secret like ingredient for the success of BTS. So it's just music that is so powerful and it's so universal. I mean, if you don't know anything about the what they're talking about, you can definitely feel something. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I listen to a lot of K-pop songs, but the music of BTS, I don't know, the chord progression, maybe arrangement, the singing style, or the emotion delivered from the I don't know, vocals. It actually makes you think, makes you wonder. It brings you bring back to your memory lane. It's so powerful, the music itself, and the lyrics. It's phenomenal. I mean, I've never seen any like contemporary teen pop or pop stars who actually talking about map of the soul, love yourself, and not just one song. The whole idea is this concept of the album, and the struggles of youth, agony, um, yeah, I mean, it's talking about who you are, and that was something really missing from the pre-existing K-pop industry. Because I mean, K-pop, we already always believed the Korean people, like expert like me or industry people, we always believe that um, this whole like visual thing and state of art music would be the only thing that we need for global audience. Because I mean, they would never understand the lyrics, or they never really kind of sympathize with the feelings, actually, the idea of philosophy or something like that. So that's why many like companies focused on the technicality, not just the narrative with stories and emotions and things like that. But BTS really changed that mindset, the concept, and the influencers now everywhere. I mean, they are constantly looking for idol artists who can write, who can produce like BTS, and who can express ideas raw. I mean, in very raw kind of narrative, more genuine, more authentic narrative. So yeah, I could spend the whole night talking
Yeah.
about BTS, but that's about it for now.
Yeah, and and I guess that's the power of music, that people can still somehow relate to this seven young men from Korea, even though they don't quite
Yeah.
understand what they're saying. But and maybe one day you can come back and tell us all about BTS.
Sure.
Yes,
Sure, sure.
but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. So thanks
Right.
again to Youngdae for this conversation. I had
Thank you
such
so
a
much.
great time, and we wish you all the best. Stay healthy. Special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for
Thank you.
making this
Thank you,
webcast a
Peter.
possibility, and to our intern Gia for getting the questions and doing social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our members and viewers. We hope you will join us again. Check out what's coming on our website, koreasociety.org, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.